Okay, my name is Stephen Bruce. I'm Executive Director of the People with Disabilities Foundation. Our topic tonight is disabled students in elementary and secondary schools, sensitivity training and development of coping skills. Sitting to my right is Dr. Nathan Scheinberg, who is a psychiatrist, and he is board certified in adult psychiatry and children's or child psychiatry. He is a clinical professor too at UC San Francisco and has written many publications, including articles such as Inpatient Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Training, and also books, including Psychoanalytical Development from 1992. His most recent book, and this is only a partial list, is entitled Lives Across Time, a 30-year study of development. The expected publication date of this book is sometime in the spring of this year. People with Disabilities Foundation is pleased to welcome Dr. Scheinberg. Sitting to his right is Ms. Rhonda Ngom, who is an attorney with the United States Department of Education, Office for Civil Rights, Region 9, which is located here in San Francisco. They are responsible for enforcing compliance with Section 504 regulation. Section 504 is of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the regulations, I believe, were first published and implemented by then the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in 1977 or 78. They are also charged with the responsibility for implementing the implementing regulations of Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. And as some of you may know, Title II relates to the government and governmental entities. Recently, and I believe it's been within the last 6 to 8 months, guidelines were published by the United States Department of Education, by the Office of Special
Education and Rehabilitative Services.
Thank you. Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, entitled Disability Harassment Guidance. Ms. Ngom, is going to spend some time describing what they are, how OCR goes about screening complaints and doing compliance enforcement, which rarely involves litigation, but is done as they enforce other regulations through the threat of withholding federal monies to school districts. The harassment guidance documents were very recently published, and Ms. Ngom will explain why they were only recently published, what led up to the publication, and what they are expected to achieve. So this time I'm going to hand the mic over to Rhonda Ngom to discuss Department of Education Disability Harassment Guidance publication. Ms. Ngom?
Thank you, Steve. Thank you all for coming. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. You all look very comfortable in your chairs, but if you would like to move forward, we could have more of a discussion kind of format. Don't feel obligated to do that if you're already seated comfortably, though. I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the recent publication of the Disability Harassment Guidance. As Steve mentioned, this guidance was published by the Federal Department of Education in conjunction with the state, their Office for Special Education and Rehabilitative Services. And what's most important for schools to understand is that their obligations to respond to disability harassment are the same as their obligations to respond to any other form of harassment, including race harassment and sex harassment. I'm not arguing that these forms of harassment are the same or are equivalent. In fact, I'm not putting any kind of value judgment on these different forms of harassment. But what I am saying is that in terms of compliance obligations, a school's responsibility is the same. And regardless of, well, I'll just say that as soon as schools' red lights and red flags start going off when they see a situation that might implicate disability harassment, the better off they're going to be in terms of complying with the regulations that we enforce. Right now, most people don't see disability harassment in the same sort of genre that they see race harassment or sex harassment, but it would behoove schools to do that. There are a number of rights that protect students who have disabilities from disability harassment. The first is, speak up. The first is a right to an equal educational opportunity. This right is prescribed by, as Steve mentioned, both Title II of the American Disabilities Act of 1990, which addresses state and local educational entities, as well as Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which addresses institutions that receive federal funds. The formal definition of disability harassment is as follows: intimidation or abusive behavior toward a student based on disability that creates a hostile environment by interfering with or denying a student's participation in or receipt of benefits, services, or opportunities in an institution's programs. And as I'm sure you are all aware, disability harassment can take a number of different forms. It need not be just, and when I say not just, I'm referring to what people typically associate with harassment: physical, threatening, harmful, intimidating behavior. It can also be, written statements or name calling or more subtle forms of harassment that alienate and exclude people who have disabilities. And I know we'll get into some specific examples of disability harassment as our talk continues. Second, students who have disabilities are also protected from harassment under their right to have a FAPE, or a free appropriate public education. This is also prescribed by Section 504, Title II, also IDEA, which is enforced by OSERS. And it works like this: when a student is harassed based on disability, his or her ability to participate in the educational program is diminished. Therefore, the right to FAPE is violated. And then, of course, there are also state and local laws that may protect a student from disability harassment. So there are basically three options that a student has when confronted with a situation where he or she is being harassed. One is the state or local level, which generally is comprised of due process remedies and grievance procedures. Next is to file a complaint with our office. And third, there's always the possibility of going to court in a private right of action. And this could potentially result in emotional distress damages. A school's response to a situation where someone has been harassed based on disability should be threefold. First, they've got to have policies that prevent disability harassment. These policies are preventative, or should serve a preventative purpose, and if they're not, they should look at revising them. Second, a school must have grievance procedures in place that effectively address disability harassment. Now, these grievance procedures need not be separate grievance procedures from other grievance procedures that they have, but they must be effective in this particular situation. And third, a school must take prompt and effective action to stop, prevent, and remedy the harassment that's happening. There are several measurable steps that we, the Office for Civil Rights, recommends schools take in order to facilitate and ensure that their educational environment is safe for all children. And these include promoting an environment of awareness and weaving disability harassment issues into the curriculum and programs in the school, both inside and outside the classroom. We encourage students and staff to talk about issues that have to do with disability harassment and to report any disability harassment that they might witness. We encourage schools to widely publicize anti-harassment policies and procedures, to provide up-to-date appropriate training to staff and students, to counsel when a situation of disability harassment has arisen, to counsel not only the student who is the victim of the harassment, but also, very importantly, to counsel the student who perpetrated the harassment. We encourage schools to implement monitoring programs to follow up on issues, on discrimination, harassment issues that have already been resolved, make sure that they continue to be resolved. And lastly, we encourage schools to regularly assess and modify their policies and procedures to ensure effectiveness. That's basically what I wanted to say about the guidance itself. When we receive a complaint of disability harassment, the standard that we use to determine whether or not the misconduct actually rises to the level of harassment is whether or not the misconduct is sufficiently severe, persistent, and pervasive. The effects of the harassment need not be tangible on the student. What we require is that the student's ability to benefit from and participate in the educational program has been adversely affected. Are there any questions?
Rhonda, I have one, if I might. When I first read the disability guidelines several months ago, one thing that struck me was in one of the examples, it said permitting students to throw obstacles in the path of wheelchairs. And then I thought, now after I guess 23 or so years after the enforcement of the Section 504 regulations by your office and others, does the staff in a school district really look the other way? I mean, this is the 21st century. Is this really going on? In terms of numbers, whether it's regional or national, maybe you can go into a little detail. To me, it sort of boggles the mind to think in this day and age that things we thought about 30 or 20, 30 years ago would occur. I mean, how do you respond?
Absolutely. First of all, I will say that the term disability harassment is one that is new for the courts and for OCR. And so we haven't had the numbers of cases, disability harassment cases, that to accurately reflect the real life experiences of people who have disabilities in schools. We are seeing a consistent and steady increase in the numbers of cases that we get that specifically implicate disability harassment. And I think that's because the consciousness of parents and community members is growing about disability harassment. They realize that they can file complaints on that basis. But yes, it's going on every day. And, let me give you an example of a real life case. A parent who called our office seeking technical assistance. Her daughter has Williams syndrome and is a high school student. And her condition has led to disfigurement of her body. She is clinically obese, and her condition affects the way that her skin falls on her body. And she's a high school student and was very, very excited about going to her prom. And this parent relayed to us the whole process of getting ready for the prom and finding a dress that she could wear that would be appropriate, which was a challenge for their family, but they were successful in doing that. She dropped her daughter off at the prom. No sooner than 10 minutes that the parent had been home, she got a call from the school saying, "Come pick up your daughter. The students are teasing her mercilessly, and there's nothing we can do about it." It's a really sad scenario. Number one, that the students didn't have sensitivity enough to be able to accept someone who was different from them. But two, that the school was completely paralyzed by the situation because they had never dealt with it before. And that's part of, I think, what this guidance is designed to address. If students had been teasing this particular girl because of her race, I will bet you that the school would have had something different to say. Or something to say. Something more than, "Come pick up your child. We can't handle this situation." So there definitely needs to be increased education and awareness of school administrators to effectively handle these kinds of situations. And that's just a very, very, very small example. And I say small not to diminish that particular girl's experience, but that this is happening constantly, daily to students. And unfortunately, our caseload numbers don't reflect, I think, the reality that's going on out there for students.
What sorts of remedies do you folks offer or suggest in the range of this sort of harassment?
That's an excellent question, and I think we'll revisit that throughout our talk. But the first thing that comes to mind is sensitivity training for the students, for whatever teacher chaperones, like we're there at the prom, for example, for the administrators. So at every level of the school community, I think that tolerance needs to be taught. And that changes, I think, depending upon who you're speaking to. So if we're talking about sensitivity training for elementary school students, I think what we're focusing on are more general tolerance issues. I think as we start to develop in the high school levels, and particularly teachers and administrators, we want to talk more about specific kinds of difference and what those kinds of difference mean. I am not aware of a whole lot of resources out there to deal with this, but there are a lot of, as I'm sure you're aware, nonprofit advocacy groups, and a lot of them have components that go out and talk with people about disabilities and about difference. So that's probably the resource that I would tap into.
Well, do you ever think of school transfer or tuition in private school or money damages or even homeschooling or maybe something to even ameliorate the handicap? I don't know if that's possible.
All of those are options. Of course, we're charged with, as our schools, educating people who have disabilities in the most integrated setting possible. But when that is not possible, all those alternatives are considered. And I think probably the most appropriate place to have discussions about appropriate educational placements are in individualized education program meetings, IEP meetings, or Section 504 meetings. This harassment was sent to superintendents of schools, and it is then their responsibility to disseminate this information to their school communities. We can encourage school districts to disseminate this particular document down to their parent community. What districts are required to do based on Section 504 and Title II is to notify parents of their rights under both of those. They're not required to distribute this document or any other document per se, right? So each school district comes up with its own sort of set of list of rights that parents are afforded under Section 504 and Title II, and parents sign off on them, saying that they've received them. But of course, parents sign them without really reading them, or they read them and don't understand them because they're written in a way that's too complex, or they were on the back of the form and the parents got just the front of the form and they signed something anyway. There are lots of ways the system can kind of break down that way, but I think the real issue that you're getting at is changing the culture and consciousness understanding in the schools, and that's a long process and it's a frustrating one. And when we get a complaint, we often require training or working with a nonprofit agency on an ongoing basis. But it's an issue where I sometimes become frustrated at a lack of ability to be in a district all the time and watch that progress. We do monitor the districts where we receive complaints, but that monitoring is like, unless you're really there, you can't on paper get the full understanding of whether or not the culture is evolving.
Rhonda, is there any way outside of investigating a complaint and possibly finding noncompliance in this area that OCR could have more of a proactive role? For example, these guidance, this letter with the harassment guidance in it, and incidentally, we do have copies here for everyone in the audience, is really written in plain English that most people can understand. I was not aware, and I'm someone who used to work for OCR years ago, that this even existed recently. Is there any way that the districts can proactively be required to disseminate this to down the levels, from the superintendent's office to the teachers and of course to the parents and families? Is that within your office's jurisdiction?
We can't require a district to disseminate a particular document, like I was saying, but the dissemination process of the information here is definitely something that parents need to know about, and they don't, right? We recognize that this is not something that's well known, but it also was published fairly recently, and my hope is that we can do more outreach in school communities so that people's awareness of their rights with regard to disability harassment can be increased.
Mrs. Sklar?
Can you require the districts, though, to develop these guidelines and publish them? Because
Yes.
lawyers say they should.
Yes.
And has your office done so? Do they have guidelines for schools to certify that they have developed these guidelines?
The answer to your first question is yes, that we can require, like I said, not only that there are anti-harassment policies, but also that there are grievance procedures effective to address this particular issue. Unfortunately, although we are seeing an increase in these kind of cases, we aren't seeing a whole lot of them. So our opportunities based on our caseload to do that have been limited. Now, that doesn't prevent us from proactively going out and identifying districts that we think have problems and working with those districts.
My question is, do you have the authority to require the districts to certify that they have developed these guidelines and their own grievance procedures for this sort of harassment?
The answer is yes, but it really is on a case-by-case basis. That's how we do most of the work that we do. Occasionally, we will do an affirmative compliance review of a district, but by and large, we work with districts based on complaints that are filed. And once a complaint is filed, yes, we have the authority to go in, look at their policies, look at their grievance procedures, require that they revise them, and work with them, hopefully in a collaborative and not adversarial way, to get them up to par. Most people do not intentionally, maliciously go out and say, I want to discriminate against Black people, poor people, people who have disabilities, women. Most people, and we're talking now about school administrators, superintendents, principals, vice principals, will come to the table and tell you, I am in the business of providing a quality education to all the students in my district. Most of them come to the table with that mindset. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't always play out the way it should, either because they're not involved in all of the instances or because they intellectually believe that, but then don't know how to go about doing it, or their actions are not consistent. But that's the first reason. Most people want to do good. Most people. The second is liability, right? This is a growing now area of the law where students can sue. That speaks to some administrators as a reason to have good policies and grievance procedures.